Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our November WMESA seminar. My name is Melanie Finch, and I convene the WMESA seminar series. So WMESA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present. The WMESA seminar series is about showcasing the amazing work of women in earth and environmental science in Australasia. So you can sign up as a member of WMESA to get notifications of upcoming seminars, or you can follow us on Twitter. So all our past seminars are available on our YouTube channel. Today's seminar is going to be presented by Emily Leyden, who is currently completing the final year of her PhD at the University of Adelaide. Emily's research examines the geochemical changes to coastal soils following sea level rise, with a particular focus on iron and sulfur chemistry and geochemical modelling. Emily previously worked at the South Australian EPA as a scientific officer, and she is the current South Australian branch president of Soil Science Australia. She's passionate about promoting soil education and training and organising workshops, webinars, student training and field trips for Soil Science Australia. So it sounds like a lot of work, a lot of important work. So now I'll hand over to you, Emily, so you take it away.
Cool, okay. Well, first I wanted to say thank you to WMESA for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research today. At PhD level, you don't get too many opportunities to talk for this length of time. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I was somewhat daunted to give this talk, given the calibre of the previous speakers. There's been so many excellent talks on a range of different topics of geoscience and earth science. But I particularly enjoyed the talks that incorporated how people arrived at their research direction, some of the challenges that are faced by women in earth sciences, and how people talk about how they got to where they are today. So with that in mind, I thought I'd talk about some of the research which I've been involved with over the last 12 years since finishing honours, but also how I arrived at a somewhat unique situation of starting a PhD in my mid-30s. So I just first wanted to cover off some thank yous. Today I'm coming to you from Ghana country. I want to start to thank my group members, the Biogeochemical Research Group, in particular my supervisor and group leader, Associate Professor Luke Mosley, who's always been incredibly supportive and encouraging, both as a primary supervisor in my PhD, but also as a colleague at the South Australian EPA. Special mentions also to Dr. John Tibby, who was my honours supervisor way back when, and Dr. John Hudson, who really inspired my love of soil science. And thanks again to my research group. It's great to work within a group of like-minded people. So before I launch in, I wanted to put this in as I was referring to it as I go along. So here I'm comparing water flow in soils to the flow of work in career paths. So I think when we talk about water flow in soils, it's a particular branch of soil physics. We think about drainage. And we think that's in a simple way, in through the top, out through the bottom. But in actual fact, the way the water finds its path at a microscale is often not linear. So it gets constricted along the way, it slows down in some parts, it speeds up in others, and it has many twists and turns. So the word to describe the flow of water in soils is tortuosity. It's dependent upon the pore space which is available for water flow through that soil. So a whole lot of clever people have devised numerous models to characterise tortuosity, but for the most part in the real world, it remains incredibly complex. So I think this is very much like our career paths, and especially the career paths for women in science. So we think when we begin in our 20s that it might, our career paths might take a couple of turns along the way, but generally the path is clear and there's an unrestricted flow for great things to happen. But I think for many, and especially women in soil science, it's a lot more complex than that. And just like the real world water flow in soils, there are times when you have free flow of your career and your job. The pore space is large enough for things to happen without much getting in the way. But then there are times where the flow comes across a major constriction and it begins to slow, go sideways or even cease. So I think we need to start to think about our careers more like the second example rather than the first, as there's numerous complexities along a career path that will impact the flow at different times. I think this is a conversation we need to have more and potentially figure out ways which we can share constrictions between genders, At the moment, overwhelmingly, it's women who experience these constrictions in their career path. For me, the constrictions I've faced have actually been a really positive thing so far. And I hope to make the case that these constrictions can be a good thing. And I certainly don't pretend to understand all circumstances, and I acknowledge that solving gender disparity in science is incredibly complex, and we need numerous solutions. But I think this is a good part of the conversation to have. So I'll leave that there for a minute and go on to my area of interest, which is soils. So soils and regolith, they often used interchangeably, but a lot of people in geology and geoscience call soil regolith. So is soil regolith? Well, in soil science, we tend to think of regolith as the broken up rock sitting on top of the bedrock. And soil is the, the regolith is the bit that sits on top of the bedrock, but soil is the portion of the regolith that is able to support plant life. So it's the bit that has the bacteria, it contains organic matter and liquids and minerals. So this is why it's quite separate from something called regolith, even though these terms are used interchangeably. So soil science can often be seen as the invisible earth science, and many people don't consider it until they have a really big problem that needs to be solved. But soils are everywhere, and once they're part of your consciousness, you can't help but be drawn to them. So often I'll see road cuttings or urban building sites and riverbeds, and of course the soil pit, and they naturally draw your interest once you can see them. So there's a huge variation in colour and texture and grain size and redox features, organic matter and different horizons, as you can see in some of these profiles. And this information can tell you a huge amount about how the soils got there and what has happened in that landscape in both recent and long history. So one of the best things about being a soil scientist is going out with a colleague who's worked in soil classification for many years, finding a process and using all these clues to create a picture of how that landscape has evolved. So soils in Australia are really old. They've been sitting around for a long time. Unlike most of the world where soils are newly formed after the last ice age, our soils have been eroding and weathering for many thousands of years. So they're often deficient in things like phosphorus and calcium and potassium. And this presents unique challenges to soil scientists. So soils are having a moment at the moment with the talk around carbon sequestration, solving climate change. And this is a really interesting conversation to play out. I think some of the claims are wildly optimistic, but I guess the good thing about the conversation is it's great to see healthy soils and soil carbon be on the agenda in agriculture and more widely. So although soil science is probably 90% focused on agriculture, it's not just about agriculture. So I look at soils in an environmental science context. So in this context, we look at soils, we focus on soils usually when there's been an environmental change, such as a drought or a pollution event, and that alters the soil in some way. This then can create potentially an impact which affects humans or ecosystems or both. So this is what my research has really been centred around for the last 12 years, so how soils change in the environment and what effect that has. So I first started my first job in 2009 after honours, and this was at the height of the millennium drought. I was employed as a field officer as part of the monitoring team, and I would go around collecting samples and collating data from different sites around the lower lakes and tributaries. As you can see up here in my little graphic, this was a period of time in my career where I had pretty free flow. I could work late, I have big days out in the field and just concentrate at the hand. The lower lakes are on Ngarrindjeri country and they're the terminus of the River Murray at the end of the system. This is just a little map of Australia, which will zoom out and then zoom in. You can see the River Murray flows down through South Australia, going a bit further, and then it flows into Lake Alexandrina. Lake Alexandrina then fills up Lake Albert, and then they flow through the barrages out to the river mouth and around here around the Gould Channel as well. So during the millennium drought, the water flow was almost non-existent. So this graph shows the water flow over Lock 1, which is about 250 kilometres upstream of Lake Alexandrina. And you can really see the water level decline over this period over Lock 1. But this second graph is probably more interesting in terms of what happened with the soil. So this is the water level drop in meters AHD, and you can see down here, this part here was really where we saw a dramatic decline in the water level in soils in this area, and drove some of the devastating impacts in the soils around the boundaries of the lower lakes and tributaries. But it's important to note that allocation for agriculture was still going on during this period. So if we just had 10% of the water that allocated during that time, we would have seen real minimisation in some of the effects on the soils. That's an important thing to note. So what happened? So this is a picture of Lake Alexandrina. So this is actually the lake bed. So you can see the amount of space that was actually dried out during this drying phase, and it's quite a shallow lake system. So you had large areas that had dried out. So prior to the drought, these soils in this area had built up large quantities of hypersulfidic materials. And this was due to stable water levels since a lot of the regulation of the River Murray they were put in the 1940s. That led to anoxic conditions in the presence of sulfate and iron, and created large areas of pyrite buildup within these sediments. So when they were exposed to oxygen, in the drying phase, this pyrite was oxidised. And anyone who knows about pyrites, it's pretty much harmless if it remains saturated. But when it is exposed to oxygen, it undergoes a chemical change. And if you have water involved with that, then you have sulfuric acid. This was really happening from 2006 onwards, and things got dire as less and less water came into the lake, and more lake bed was exposed and oxidised, and that pyrite was oxidised. So this is a graphic from one of the embayments, and you can really show what happened. So up here you can see the water level, what happened before the droughts. That's where the water level was there. Things dried out especially over 2008 was probably one of the worst years. And there was a lot of cracking in the soil, so that actually enhanced the oxygen transport down to lower depths. So even more and more pyrite was oxidised. And then you'd have things like local rainfall in the area, and you would have sulfuric acid be produced, which would dramatically drop the pH. So we had peak pHs as low as 2.6, 2.8, and around that area. So secondary acid dilution reactions can produce even more acidity. And of course, the problem with this as well is you dissolve lots of the metals from the soil and release those into these puddles or ponds. So this photo here is a photo of another embayment called Boggy Lake. And I took this picture when we were out sampling, and you can see there the PEDs, which had cracked and then refilled with water. And this water body here was about pH 3 the day that we were sampling. The aquatic life was pretty much decimated in these areas. And in fact, the biologist at the EPA at the time, Peter Goonan, said it was one of the most devoid areas of life he'd ever seen. And this was a guy who'd worked in around mines and mine drainage areas. So it was pretty devastating. There was it was a pretty, as I say, major environmental disaster, and the government tried to put in different measures to try and combat this acidification and combat the drying. The huge bund walls were built to try and keep water into particular areas, which had been determined as high risk of acidification. So the idea of this is if you've got a certain amount of water, and you really need to prioritise that to keep certain areas saturated. And then, of course, you put pumps in to keep as much of those soils saturated as possible. These are really unpopular at the time, as people really thought that their area of the river was being condemned if they were downstream of these bunds. So we really had an important messaging campaign to get it out there, that what we were doing was trying to keep those soils saturated, not actually condemn certain areas to more devastation. The other thing that was done at the time was that aerial limestone was actually aerially bombed using crop dusters. And these were over these embayment areas where we saw those really low pHs. And some work done at the time measuring, you can see that the 3 bombing campaigns they did actually were quite successful in rising the pH and increasing the alkalinity in the area. But it did take a while, and this was because a lot of the soluble metals that were around in the water body actually coated the surface of the limestone and rendered it inactive. So in the end, by the end of 2010, what really made the difference was the drought-breaking rains. And you can see in the graph down the bottom there how the water level increased over quite a short period of time. It was sort of, we were doing monthly sampling, and every time we'd go back, there'd be, you know, another area saturated, which was great to see. And it was this water bringing alkalinity and dilution that diluted those low pHs and those metals. So during this time, I was working at different sites, but my main project was, I was given a project looking at the shallow soil and groundwater at several key areas. And this is really where I got, I suppose, mainly interested in the shallow groundwater and soils. So these sites had a series of piezometers, which were put down deep to about 80 centimetres. And we could monitor these during the drying phase, which was here, and then as the water came back, even right back to when they were completely overtopped with water, we could isolate these piezometers underwater and actually isolate that surface water from the groundwater. And what we found was basically, even though the overlying water was essentially back to normal, the groundwater was still very much acidic. And it actually remained so for the next 6 years until the water came back. So one of the ways that pyrite oxidation can be naturally remediated is through sulfate reductions. That is basically returning that oxidized pyrite back to pyrite. And for this to happen, you need bacteria and you need anoxic conditions. But you also need food for the bacteria, and this needs to be there in the form of organic matter. Now, the problem with these soils was that the lower lake sediments were very, very low in organic matter. They're less than 0.1%. So in these soils, so the sulfate reduction processes were really low, and acidity persisted for, I think it was more than 7 years. We published this in 2016, and there was still, it was still very slowly. It was, the pH was coming up, but it was incredibly slow. And we put this down to the lack of organic matter to really drive these sulfate reduction processes. So when the water came back, we all breathed a bit of a sigh of relief. But then another issue rose, and this was further up the River Murray, but still below Lock 1. So this map here, you can see are a lot of different areas of agriculture along this stretch of the River Murray. And this diagram here is a good way to sort of show how these particular farms are set up. So before the drought, you had these areas, these floodplains were isolated from the River Murray via an embankment, and they were drained down to around about 80 centimetres, and they were flood irrigated. So they would pump water from the River Murray over this land, and then it would flow via gravity to these return drains. And they were called salt drains because they typically would take the salt off this landscape so they could grow lovely grass for the cows. And this was all fine, no problems, until the drought came along and there was a severe drop in that water level, and it was even more pronounced up in these areas. So again, you dried out these areas, and of course you've had stable water levels here over 80 years with the presence of iron and sulfate, and you've built up pyrite. And when there was no water anymore and no water table, and the water table had dropped, you're acidifying that pyrite. So after the water came back, everyone started to put water back on their fields. And this is a picture here showing the return drain. This is what it looked like pre-drought. So this would then flow back out, be pumped out to the River Murray. But when they did the same thing post-drought, this is what the drains look like. And this water in here, again, was incredibly low pH, so pH 3 and 4, and very, very high metals. So on the river side, this is what was being pumped out into the River Murray. And this is a particular concern for the EPA at the time, because 2 of the major drinking water offtakes are located downstream of these. The red crosses there are the acidic swamps, and they were all pumping their water because they had to keep these farms operational out to the River Murray. So there was lots of monitoring done. So we would monitor this plume and see how it would dilute out to the River Murray. And there was a lot of water at the time, so we found it was diluting quite quickly. But the risk was if the water levels dropped again, and there wasn't enough water down here, then you wouldn't get that dilution that you were getting in 2011-12. So this was a real risk, not only for the EPA, but also SA Water. And it caused infrastructure damage on the farms. You can see this is us collecting some samples and what it looked like. Some work was done to see if they could spray limestone or hydrous limestone into these drains before they went out to the river. And that was quite successful, but was incredibly expensive. And no one really had any money in these fields, in these areas, because they'd just been decimated by drought. In fact, I think of the, probably 3 or 4% of the farms that were there, or dairy farms that were there pre-drought, are there now. So it was a really devastating time. But what we really needed was for natural remediation to start to take place with that sulfate reduction I was talking about before. The water level came back and provided that anoxic conditions to begin that sulfate reduction. So this graph here shows on the y-axis, you've got depth below ground and pH along the x-axis. And you can see that area of low pH around about 80 centimetres. So below that area, the top was always wet and dry in history when they were irrigating, and the stable water levels for the build-up of fire is below 80 centimetres. And that's what dried out during the drought. So you can see there, that's the pH right up from 2011 to 2018, and you see there's not much change. As opposed to the soils down the lower lakes, these soils did actually have some organic matter in them. So they had about 1 to 2%, and that should be enough fuel to really kickstart that sulfate reduction processes. The work that was done with some German colleagues was really asked the question of why are these soils staying so acidic after so long when they've got anoxia and they've got all the things they need? And it was really to do with the type of carbon which was available. So this shows the different NMR spectras at different levels in the soil. So you can see the topsoil here is very different from the subsoil. So in particular, these two groups of carbon are quite high in the topsoil, but very low in the subsoil. And this particular group is quite high in the subsoil, but low in the topsoil. So although you had organic matter there, it wasn't actually available for the bacteria to break down. So it had very low biodegradability. And of course, there was no fresh supply of organic matter to these layers. So work that they did in the lab showed if they were able to, for these same soils, if they were able to supply fresh organic matter in lab mesocosms, the actual recovery happened within weeks. So in this story of sulfate reduction, organic matter amount, but also type is really, really important. That was some of the learnings that came from this particular time. But some of this work continued without me, because in 2013, I stopped work and had my first baby. And as often the case, I had 2 kids within a couple of years of one another. So during this time, I really only worked intermittently. I was lucky to be able to work part-time. I know this isn't available to everyone. I did pick up a casual contract back at the EPA, and I was able to actually publish some of the work we'd done during that time. But for me, this represented a really big career constriction period. And I've done this in my little graphic up here. You can see there was a bit of flow, but it wasn't really going anywhere. And for a big period of time, like 4 years is a big period of time. So I look back now, and I'm actually really grateful for this pause for many reasons. But at the time, I was really quite fearful about what this amount of time out of the workforce would mean, particularly for my career. And I really loved working, especially in this area. So this is really common amongst women who go part-time after having kids. And the data shows that really you do actually fall behind, often for many years after this, and it's quite difficult to catch up. And I think this is one of the many reasons why there's a so-called cliff of women in senior positions, academia and elsewhere. So in my circumstance, my partner had an inflexible job, he earned more money than I did, so it made sense for me to be the one that took on this part-time role over this time. And often this is the case with women. So women earn less overall, so it makes more sense for them to take time off. And this, of course, then perpetuates the cycle of women having more part-time roles, earning less overall, and then not going on to senior positions. So it led me to think about this period of career constriction. I think it's a really important part of the conversation, and it's outlined really beautifully in the book The Wife Drought by Annabel Crabb. She goes into it in much more detail and much more eloquently than I could ever do, so I really recommend giving it a read. But essentially, we really need to think about that this career constriction is basically inevitable after you have kids. And it needs for someone to be flexible. But what if we all embraced it? And by all, I mean every gender. So what if that career constriction phase was equally split between the genders? So not necessarily at the same time. Of course, we need and money to survive. But if both genders experienced career constrictions, that is time away from the workforce, time when research slows or ceases, promotions are passed by, then we might start to find that we might have to tackle inequality in a small way. So just imagine if your male colleague had taken some serious time out of their career to be a primary carer. This would completely change how their career progresses, which might mean you're equally behind in the amount of papers you produce. You might have also both missed out on grants, and there might be that similar gap in the CV. So we can't deny that children change the way you work forever. Someone has to be there for the phone call from school when someone's sick and during school holidays. And of course, you know, the pandemic's really showed us or highlighted this inequality in I suppose the flexibility needs of the different genders. But of course, why does this always have to be female? And wouldn't it be better if we could equally be able to take turns with this? So I know this topic is much more complex than I'm briefly talking about today. But if we were to encourage more males to be able to have flexible work arrangements, that's probably something, if you'd ask, 90% of males would want. If it's more accepted to do this at different times in their careers, women would be able to take off into more senior positions to have more flow during their career. And career constrictions would become more commonplace, and you wouldn't just leave behind one gender. And I think one of the ways we can start to sell this is that it can be a real positive. So for me, it certainly was. It gave me a break to think, do I want to stay in government or do I want to pursue research? And if we all had this career break or slowing or part-time nature of work just for a small period of time, it might really benefit us. So the problem of constriction is not just affecting women. And I don't pretend that this is going to solve all the different problems with gender parity in the workforce, but I think it's really worth having that conversation and looking at the mechanisms that can be put in place to change things. So we can really both sort of have experience a career constriction, maybe have a benefit from that, and both also benefit from maybe the flow if someone else is taking on that flexibility role. So that's all I've got to say about that particular topic. But I think I wanted to go into more detail, but without the time, it's difficult. But for the career constriction for me led me to start a PhD, which most thought was complete madness at the time. But I really wanted to follow this research, and I became more and more interested. And without the PhD ticket, I suppose, I thought it was really difficult to be able to move forward in that research space. So in 2017, I signed up to my PhD, and my aim was really to get my head around more of the concepts of this sulfur and iron soil chemistry, but also learn about the practicalities and realities that come with doing research, which really only a PhD can do. And again, I've shown my little graphic in the corner there. You can see while there's more flow, there's still some constrictions that come with having some older kids around. So, but definitely better than going sideways, I suppose. So my PhD is split into 4 parts and is quite broad, but its main focus is how rising sea levels change the soil geochemistry. So we're going to see more and more coastal areas inundated with seawater over the next 100 years with climate change projections. And this is a little map just of a river south of Adelaide. This is from Coastal Risk Australia, who does elevation maps of different inundation scenarios. As you can see, with a 50 centimetre sea level rise scenario, you're inundating more areas, but also the frequency of flooding will increase under our sea level rise predictions. So how will this change the soil geochemistry in different areas which will be under threat from sea level rise? Of course, seawater brings sulfate and inundation brings anoxic conditions. So we're still very much my research is still very much front and centre with that sulfate and iron cycle. But mostly now I'm dealing with reductive processes rather than oxidative processes, which I did back in my previous work at EPA. So the first of the 4 parts is looking to see what happens to the soil geochemistry when it's inundated with soil. So we wanted inundated with seawater, sorry. So obviously seawater brings with it different ions such as calcium, magnesium and potassium. And we hypothesised that it would also bring a redox change, as I've talked about. So there has been some research on sea level rise worldwide, but it's mainly focused in organic matter dynamics. So what happens to whether organic matter is decomposed more quickly or less quickly, depending on different sea level or seawater inundation scenarios. But the information worldwide on metal geochemistry is pretty scarce. So in Australia, it's mainly focused on acid sulfate soils, but ordinary soils, so your ordinary freshwater river that will be inundated under sea level rise prediction, there isn't much around, which is surprising for us. So we went and collected a whole lot of different types of soils. These were either freshwater soils, which had not been exposed to seawater inundation, and then we compared that to hypersaline soils, which do experience seawater inundation. And we also included some acid sulfate soils in there too, for old time's sake. And we conducted a lab-based column experiment where we flushed these soils with seawater over a 2-week period of time. So simulating that first flush of seawater, which would happen with a storm surge or a high tide. And then again, to go through these, but we focused on the redox chemistry and also the metal geochemistry, as that was where there was a big gap in the literature. So what we found was that seawater inundation actually mobilised metals from the soil into the pore water really rapidly, much more than we expected. And we hypothesised this for 2 reasons. And so this was in the freshwater soils, and we're comparing those to the hypersaline soils. The freshwater soils was really where we saw that mobilisation of metals. So we hypothesised 2 different reasons for this. And the first was to do with cation exchange. So this up here, you can see a soil particle in the orange, and soil particles are typically negatively charged. So they hang on to a whole bunch of things, including a whole bunch of metals, which are positively charged with their soil surfaces. So when we introduced seawater, it brought with it a whole lot of new positively charged cations. And those cations then preferentially sorbed onto those clay particles and knocked off a lot of the metals which were weakly bound to that soil particle. So this was one of the reasons why we think we saw some of those, that metal release into the pore waters following inundation. The other reason was that the incoming seawater decreased the redox condition of those soils, which caused the reductive dissolution of iron and manganese oxides in those soils. So this here shows a bit of diagram. It looks complicated, but all it's really showing is the different, I've taken iron here in this example, the different states of iron at different reductive potentials and different pHs. So this is oxidized and this is reduced. And so depending on where you sit at different pHs and different redox, your iron oxide or iron species will be different. So when we started these studies, so the initial condition, I suppose, of those freshwater soils, existed a lot as these iron oxides in soils. And that's these green squares here. The hypersaline soils represented over here in the blue diamonds. So when we introduced the seawater, what we found was that we reduced the we actually were reductively dissolving these iron oxides, and you can see the open squares here is where we reduced those species. So we were transforming these iron oxides, reductively dissolving them and releasing iron 2 into solution. And we saw a very similar picture with the manganese oxides. So we saw large spikes of manganese as well. The thing about iron oxides is they also have a whole lot of metals which hang on to them. So as we reductively dissolved these iron oxides, not only did we increase that iron 2 and manganese, we also increased a whole lot of these other metals into solution when we were doing this. So that was a really interesting finding from that particular paper, and I've got this in for review at the moment. But of course, it always produces more questions than answers. And this was just looking at, this particular study was looking at the pore waters. So we wanted to know whether that metal exchange occurs again and again, or is it limited to that first flush? That's still an outstanding question I hope to answer potentially. And also the fate of the pore waters in those metals. So obviously you have an overlying water body like we did in the lower lakes, and how much of those pore waters are diluted. And depending, I suppose that depends really on how much flow you have and the nature of those overlying surface water bodies. The other thing we were interested in was what happens when you saturate these coastal soils for long periods of time. So that made up the second part of my PhD. So in this particular part, we took soil cores from a transect north of Adelaide. This is a coastal transect. So you've got salt marsh here, mangroves, and then the sea. And what we did is we took some intact cores. So this is a little sped up video of Tan and I taking these soil cores, these intact cores, which was an interesting experience. We had to take 20 of them. And then I had to repeat it all because they compacted too much because it was too dry. So it was definitely one of those really great PhD experiments that teaches you a lot and builds character for sure. So we took these intact cores when we eventually got them done, and we took them back to the lab and we set them up on a bench. And what we did is we inundated them slowly over time. So, and we had these little pore water samplers that enabled us to sample the pore water as each level was inundated. So we didn't just swamp it with water, we increased the water level very slowly. So the bottom was inundated for longer, obviously, than the top. And again, what emerged, now I wanted to show the data, but I think it was going to take up too much time, so I haven't put it in. But again, organic matter plays a role really front and centre with what was happening. So we looked at the different geochemistry, but in particular, the iron reduction and sulfate reduction. And what we find is the longer these sediments are inundated, the more iron reduction you have, and you can actually run out the iron that you're producing and actually build up sulfide in these lower layers. But of course, this really is dependent upon the organic matter content, but also the organic matter type. So this is a story I'm trying to put together in a paper now. It's a bit complicated, but I'm sure we'll get there. So another part was to see if we could use sulfur isotopes to trace seawater inundations. This was sort of like a bit of a sub-project, which took up way more time than I thought it ever would. So different sources of sulfate have unique signatures, which makes them a really good tracer in the environment. So seawater has a really distinct signature of 21.7, and then we call it per mil. That's just, I won't go into it, but it's just how we kind of classify isotopes. But unfortunately, sulfur isotopes have been really difficult to measure, and it's because they have, in typical ICP-MS, they have a lot of interferences at their mass charge ratio. So the University of Adelaide got a new ICP-MS called the triple quad ICP-MS, which is a mass shift triple quad ICP-MS, a mouthful. And it was my job to have a look to see whether we could use sulfur isotopes as a tracer. And the advantage of this machine was that the first quad takes out a lot of the interfering ions. So you don't need to go through sometimes the onerous procedures of purification of the sulfur. So really what you could do is get your water sample, dilute it, put it on the machine. Or this was the idea, get your water sample, dilute it, put it on the machine and get a signature that is accurate. So we compared it against different standards and we got a pretty good result. Like, it's not as accurate as some of the more precise measures, the multi-collectors. But for our applications, when we have an isotope signature that is really broad, so isotope signatures have signatures that are really different from one another. For example, a pyrite soil would be -21 per mil, whereas seawater is +21 per mil. So you can see there's a big gap between that. So a little bit of inaccuracy in terms of its repetition is not such a big deal when you're looking at a scale change over that distance. So we found it had pretty good accuracy with the standards, but we also tried to see how it went with those soils which we inundated with seawater. So we got an individual sulfur isotope signature of those 12 different types of soil, and they ranged, as I say, from -22.4 to +25. And each one of those soils, after it was inundated with seawater, actually increased its signature to close to seawater, 21.7, but I meant 21.5, sorry. And it showed it could be a really useful tracer of seawater inundation in different environments. And what it means is it's actually open to use by people who aren't typically isotope geochemists, which is a really specialist area. So you don't need to go through those special purification processes. You really can just take a sample and put it on and see what you get. So it could be a really useful screening method for seawater inundation. So the last part of my PhD is trying to model what's happening in these environments. So obviously we had a 19-month study of inundation with those soil cores, but obviously models have bigger scope to run longer scenarios. So we collected some field data over 2 years in these landscapes, and we used those for our initial condition in our geochemical model. So the next stage of work I'm doing, I'm hoping in the next couple of months, is to see if we can model sea level rise in these environments, to see if we can get something out that makes sense. So with all that, I wanted to end with this slide and going back to that idea of career constrictions and whether they matter. And of course, we do know that they do matter, and I think they're a contributing factor to why women typically don't get to those senior positions. I do have hope though, and I think the thought of sharing that constriction can really help along the way to keep women going to achieve that success. For us, my partner will be going to part-time as I sort of go further along this research path to allow me a bit of a time of free flow after this period of constriction. And I think it's important to start to look at our careers over the long term. And I think as we start to do this, these periods of constrictions don't matter as much. And I think this can help. So this is a graph of the publishing and citation of Professor Sally Smith, who sadly passed away in 2019. She was an eminent soil scientist and one of the world expert in mycorrhizal fungi in soils. And this graph was shown by Associate Professor Tim Carbonari and reproduced with permission when he gave the Pioneer in Soil Science lecture in honour of Professor Sally Smith in 2019. And I often think back to it when I'm feeling particularly behind doing a PhD at my age. And as you can see, she first published in 1973, and I'm assuming this is probably part of her PhD. Then there was a large period, and this is greater than 10 years, where you could say in terms of academia, there isn't much happening in terms of papers and citations. And I'm assuming this is a time where she had numerous constrictions in her work life. But later in her career, presumably when she had more free flow of her career, you can see things start to take off. So I think it's really important to think of our careers as long-term pursuits, and and normalise this idea of career constrictions, and importantly begin to share them across genders and and we might then find it a bit easier to keep going and continue in the science that we love. So with that, just want to say thanks to my supervisors, and I did have a last slide there saying some tips for PhDs, but I don't know if we've got time to go to that one. But yeah.
Yeah, you can go ahead, Emily, if you want to. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. All right. I didn't know if there was many PhDs sort of going, and I certainly don't presume to be the all knowledgeable on this front, but things that have helped me, it is pretty hard. I think that the lack of income and the lack of status is difficult over time, and so don't deny that is actually hard. I think things that have worked for me is I've just tried not to be invisible. That's been my guiding principle, is just really to try and get my face out there. So I'm here, not just be in the lab, just try and get out there. So one of the things that was instrumental for me was joining Soil Science Australia and being quite a big part of that. And you get to meet people in ways that you wouldn't normally in a PhD. Similar to that, to help plan conferences and science outreach, again, helping communicate your science is really important. There's no better way of realising what you don't understand than when you're trying to explain it to someone else. So take all those opportunities you can. I say get on Twitter. It's not for everyone, but I've made some really good connections through that. And then saying yes to lots of things you don't feel ready for. Like I definitely didn't feel ready for talking today, but here I am. I didn't feel ready for taking on the president of South Australia Soil Science, but I did that anyway. I thought, what the hell? If they can do it, I can do it. So, and then setting goals, even if they're completely unrealistic, get writing, even if it's terrible, which is what I always struggle with, and have a life and a hobby outside your PhD. For me, this is my garden, keeps me going. And I think don't underestimate how much great supervisors make great PhDs. So gravitate, if you can, towards nice people. And also maybe the people, I look back and I see that a lot of my mentors have actually been male, but the difference here is that actually there have been males in their field who've always encouraged women or had had partners where they shared the load of having kids. And I think it's a really important thing. So sort of seek out those people that really typically try to promote women in their own science. And live that, I suppose, live that life where they are sharing the load. And again, your PhD is 90% persistence, 10% intelligence. I love that from Hugh Kearns from Think Well. And the other thing that keeps me going is that this is probably the only time in your professional career that you have a single research focus. So I'm trying to embrace that because I know from, I'm hoping to go onto a postdoc next year, and that will be multifaceted. You might have teaching and all sorts of things. So this is a single research focus, and so I'm trying to really lean into that. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Emily. They're great, fantastic tips. We're going to go to questions now. So if people have questions, you can pop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just sing out, and hopefully I hear you and don't speak over you. But yeah, I'm the same as you, Emily, like about saying yes to lots of things, even if you don't feel ready. It's a bit terrifying, but I think that's really great advice. So thanks for that. They're excellent tips. I was when obviously I'm not a soil scientist, so you'll have to forgive my questions. They might not be the best ones, but I was interested how you were talking about when you were working at EPA, and you put, and one of the techniques to reduce the acidification was to put limestone into the water bodies, and how it didn't work because the limestone was coated by stuff in the water or something like that. So sorry, I've probably totally misrepresented what you said.
No, that's so good.
But I was wondering whether the EPA or other bodies do experimental work before doing something like that to check whether it will work, or whether the natural system is just a bit unpredictable, so that things can kind of unexpected things might happen even when you are really prepared.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it did contribute for sure, and like the limestoning of those water bodies, so that the limestone definitely raised the pH and helped absorb the alkalinity of that limestone, definitely helped absorb some of that acidity. But I think it was complicated because at the same time the water was coming back. So we didn't know which, or they didn't know which one was kind of more successful. But I suppose the coating of the limestone was definitely an issue which slowed probably its progress. But at the time, pretty much the government as a whole, and this is mainly due Department for Environment and Water, who was leading it at the time, was just throwing everything at this situation. There wasn't any time to even run experiments. There was experiments going on during the time in terms of letting seawater in as one of the remediation strategies, because that's a big one. It's very, very controversial and topical, and people have very, very strong opinions about that. And interestingly, some of the work which I've done in my short-term study, which is the first one I did, I didn't go into the acid sulfate soil work, which we did, those two soils, because it's really, really complicated, but it increased the metal mobilisation way more than the other soils. So, and there was some work done at the time with mesocosms to sort of show that fresh water was a better option to cover these soils than seawater, because seawater would then mobilise some of those metals. And we found that too in our little study. So there was some research work going on, but in terms of the flying in over the limestone, it was pretty much just, this might work, give it a go, and then monitor it. So GEO would kind of make the decisions, and then the EPA, from a EPA perspective, would kind of monitor it to make sure that things weren't going terribly wrong and get more sort of wrong. And one of the other things they did is they tried to actually seed the lake beds to increase the organic matter. And I actually had a picture in, but I took it out because it was sort of complicated. But the EPA at the time had to actually approve that process, because they were flying in seed, but also fertiliser. And of course, it's a typically eutrophic water body. So, you know, that's a kind of one of those balancing effects that, you know, you're just like, oh, I hope this isn't going to go badly. But yeah, at the time, it was a disaster. So anything was better than nothing. So.
Wow. Yeah. Sounds really extreme, really stressful situation.
Yeah, I mean, I was only a field officer, so I don't pretend to be like any high up in the decision making, but it was an interesting thing to be involved with and sitting in on those meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a follow-up question from Vanessa. So she says a follow-up question about lime application to the drains and the lower lakes in the earlier projects. Did the lime addition end up forming a sludge in the bottom sediments with the rapid change in pH?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So that was one of the, and actually caused some of the pump problems. So they were trying to get this sort of sludge out, and I'm not sure what's happened since, whether that's still sitting there or, but these, I mean, they were pretty, yes, to answer that question, yes, there was definitely a sludge with that application. It wasn't done in lots of places because it was just expensive. So we could show that it was being diluted sufficiently in the channel. So it was like, okay, let's just keep pumping it out. And there hasn't really been a drop in water level to severe enough levels since then for it to have sort of follow-up. I mean, I think there should be follow-up, look at it, but it's all about, you know, whether there's enough funding to do that within government. So. Sure,
yeah, that makes sense. I was just pausing to see if there are anyone was going to take the opportunity to unmute themselves, but I have lots of questions, so I'll just ask you until someone interrupts me. So I've also read that Annabelle Crabb book, and I think she's brilliant, and that is such an interesting, she presented things in a way that I hadn't thought about before. So when we talk about men taking on more flexible working arrangements, so that the burden, I guess, well, I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but that, so it isn't all up to women. What do you think needs to happen there for that to occur? I guess my question is partly, partly when you have equal access to leave, sometimes like they do in, I think, Germany, they have equal access to parental leave in some way, but men don't always take it, or do you think that if the policies exist, then it will work?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and they go into detail quite a bit in the book, and they actually show that if in countries where it is actually mandatory to take paid parental leave, then there is a much more equality-driven workforce, because you just have to, and then it becomes more normal. So the more people see that it's a thing, then more people want to do it. And I think in a lot of cases that a lot of males do want to take parts of their career out. It's just not seen as an acceptable. It's seen more acceptable as the female to do it rather than the male. So I think we need to change to a society whereby it becomes more normal. And so even, I mean, for my partner, he's looking at going to part-time, and it's just people just look at him like it's mad. It's just sort of just like, why would you do that? And he's like, well, I actually want to be part of my kids growing up, and if we can work it out financially that we can both have an income, then one part-time, one full-time, and we can make it work, why wouldn't I? That this is an important part I want to experience. And so I think that's the case with a lot of males, and but it's just not socially acceptable. It's not done. I think it's more so than it used to be, but it's still not. I mean, I don't know whether I'm a bit different because I grew up in a house where my father was the home person for my teenage years, so I could have got a model for that. So it's sort of like a normal, for me, it would be normal that would happen. But I think we have to get to a level of normality for it to then self-perpetuate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that the data also backs that up, like in Norway, where I think the senior politicians and stuff did take the parental leave, the male ones, to set a sort of example for everyone, and then people kind of followed suit. So and
I think that's also important. So if you have it in terms of your supervisors, so example, my supervisor's taken equal amount of leave to his wife when they were raising the young kids, and I think that then gives him an understanding of my situation. It gives everyone a level of understanding that of what it means when you are raising young kids and you need that flexibility at different times. I think just ignoring that we need flexibility isn't the way. You have to have, someone's got to pick up someone from school, someone's got to be there when you get the phone call from school saying someone's sick. And if that was more shared, then it would allow women more flow, and it would, the more people do that, then the more people do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I was also interested to get your opinion on what you think, so professional organisations like Soil Science Australia and like WMESA, what can they offer PhD students that is sort of valuable? What's the most valuable thing they can offer to PhD students, do you think?
Well, I think connection. I think connection is the main thing. I think everything happens, and I think being, I suppose, a bit more mature age coming into this, you see how in your previous job, how jobs are given in the real world. Like, we all see the jobs that are advertised, but there's a whole suite of jobs that aren't advertised, that are through people who know people who know people who know people. And a lot of times, even the ones that are advertised, there's already a couple of people in line for it. And so I saw that at the EPA, and I think increasing connections through different organisations is the main thing. Because if you're working in a particular area, say I'm talking today and someone thinks, oh, this person knows a bit about us, so it's soils, that is a connection which is gained. So what you want to be doing is increasing those connections. Now, yes, it takes time. Creating presentations or volunteering as part of an organisation takes time. And it takes you away from your finishing a PhD, and I acknowledge that. It can be somewhat frustrating because you're like, I just need to finish, but I've also got to do this. But they are equally important. Like, if you have a PhD at the end but you have no connection, that's not going to be very helpful. So I think really the thing I would most strongly encourage PhD students to do is to find an organisation and be part of it, because typically they're made up of people who are really trying and volunteering and they need help. So any help that you can help them with is really valuable. And the connections will come, and you won't quite know where and what from, but they do. They absolutely do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I definitely second that. We love volunteers, we love help. So, yeah. Excellent. Well, we're almost at the end of the seminar time, so I think we'll